Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. This story has the kind of quiet terror that only settles in long after the moment has passed. It isn't loud. There are no screams, no chase, no sudden reveal at the time it happens. Instead, it's one of those experiences that feels strange in the moment, unsettling but incomplete, and only years later does it fully form into something horrifying. By then, there's nothing you can do about it except live with the knowledge of how close you came. It happened to a couple who were hiking in the woods late at night. Not during the day, not on a busy trail with other people around, but at midnight. The woods at that hour are a completely different place. Sounds travel differently. Shadows feel deeper. Every movement feels closer than it really is. Even familiar trails can feel wrong once the sun is gone and the world narrows down to darkness and noise. The couple wasn't doing anything especially reckless by their own standards. They enjoyed being outdoors, and nighttime hikes were something they had done before. There's a strange calm that comes with walking through the forest at night, when everything is quiet and the rest of the world feels far away. But that calm can turn into something else very quickly. At some point during the hike, the man began to feel uneasy. It wasn't a clear thought. He didn't see anyone. He didn't hear anything obvious. It was more like a sudden shift in his instincts, the kind of feeling that comes from somewhere deep and wordless. The woods felt wrong, too still, too heavy, like something was out of place. He slowed down. As he took another step, his foot landed on something soft. Not a branch, not leaves, not mud. Soft in a way that immediately registered as wrong. He stopped. For a brief moment, his mind tried to catch up with what his body had already noticed. He hadn't slipped. He hadn't stepped into a hole. Whatever it was had shape and give to it, enough that it made his stomach drop before he even knew why. He was just about to bend down or look closer when they heard movement. Bushes started rustling just a few feet away from them. Not the gentle sound of an animal passing through. Not the distant noise of wind moving leaves. This was close, sudden, intentional. Something large enough to push branches aside. Panic took over. The couple didn't stop to think. They didn't investigate. They didn't shine a light or call out. Their instincts screamed danger, and they listened. They turned and ran, hearts pounding, lungs burning, adrenaline taking over completely. They didn't look back. They didn't slow down until they were far away from that spot, away from the woods, away from whatever had been hiding there. Later, they tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was another hiker. Maybe they had overreacted. The man kept thinking about what he had stepped on, but without seeing it, his mind filled in safer possibilities. A pile of clothing, a fallen backpack, something harmless. It just felt strange in the dark. Life went on. Years passed. The moment faded into one of those odd memories you sometimes bring up in conversation. A creepy experience, a weird night. A story you tell with a laugh at the end, even though it still makes your skin crawl a little. Then one night, everything changed. Years later, the couple was watching an interview on television. The interview was with a man on death row, a serial killer. Someone whose crimes had shocked the entire country. Someone whose face and name had become symbols of something deeply evil. The interviewer asked him a question that seemed simple enough. Was there ever a moment when you were almost caught? The killer paused, then answered. He described a night in the woods. He talked about seeing a couple hiking. He talked about how they came close. He talked about how one of them stepped on a girl he had just killed. He said he was hiding in the bushes nearby, watching them, close enough to hear them, close enough to act. He said they ran away before they realized what the man had stepped on, before they saw what was at their feet. The man telling this story was Ted Bundy. When the killer finished his answer, the man watching the interview felt a chill run through his entire body. The details matched. The time, the woods, the couple, the stepping on something soft, the bushes rustling nearby. It wasn't similar. It was exact. In that moment, the story he had carried for years transformed into something else entirely. What he had stepped on wasn't a bag or clothing or debris. It was a body. The movement in the bushes wasn't an animal. It was a man who had just murdered someone and was hiding only a few feet away, watching them, deciding what to do next. They hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been within arm's reach of one of the most dangerous killers in history. The realization was overwhelming. All at once, the man understood how close they had come to death. If they had stayed just a few seconds longer, if they had investigated what he stepped on, if they had called out, if curiosity had overridden fear, any one of those choices could have changed everything. The killer was already there. He was already violent. He was already watching. The only thing that saved them was instinct. That moment of unease, that decision to run. When people talk about gut feelings, this is what they mean. Something deep inside the brain recognizes patterns the conscious mind hasn't yet processed. The body reacts before logic can catch up. In this case, that reaction saved 2 lives. What makes this story so terrifying isn't just the proximity to danger. It's the randomness of it. The idea that you can be walking through the woods, enjoying your life, completely unaware that you are seconds away from becoming part of someone else's nightmare. They didn't know who he was at the time. They didn't know what he had done. They didn't know how close they were. And that ignorance is part of what makes it so disturbing. Because it means safety is sometimes an illusion created by not knowing what's nearby. The killer's casual way of telling the story made it even worse. To him, it was just another near miss, another anecdote, another moment where things almost went differently. He didn't describe fear or panic. He described opportunity. That contrast is chilling. For the couple, it was one of the scariest moments of their lives. For him, it was just a footnote. After watching that interview, the man couldn't stop replaying the night in his mind. He remembered the feeling in his chest when something felt wrong. He remembered the texture under his foot. He remembered the sound of the bushes moving. Every memory sharpened. What if they hadn't run? What if they had tried to help? What if they had assumed someone else was in trouble? The truth is, compassion can be dangerous in the wrong context. Many people have been harmed because they tried to help, because they trusted the situation instead of their fear. This couple survived because they didn't stop to ask questions. They listened to their instincts and ran. It's unsettling to realize how thin the line was between survival and becoming another victim. There was no warning sign, no obvious threat, no clear signal that death was hiding just a few feet away. Just darkness. A strange feeling. A sound in the bushes. That's all it took. What makes this story even heavier is knowing how many people didn't get that chance. How many others encountered the same man under different circumstances and didn't escape. How many people followed curiosity instead of fear. How many moments ended differently. The woods themselves didn't look dangerous. They didn't feel like a crime scene. Nature doesn't change its appearance just because something terrible has happened there. Trees don't react. Trails don't close themselves. The forest keeps going, indifferent to what happens within it. That indifference is part of the horror. You can walk through a place where something unspeakable happened and never know it. You can step over ground that holds a secret. You can be inches away from death and not realize it until years later, sitting safely in your living room, watching a television interview. The man never forgot that interview. Once he made the connection, the memory became something else entirely. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was gratitude mixed with horror. Gratitude that they ran. Horror at what they ran from. It changed the way he thought about chance, about safety, about how much of life is shaped by split-second decisions you don't even realize you're making. He sometimes thought about the girl he stepped on, a stranger whose life had already ended by the time he arrived, someone whose body lay there in the dark, unnoticed, while the world kept moving around her. The randomness of that, too, was unbearable. She didn't get to run. She didn't get a warning. She didn't get a second chance. The couple did, and that knowledge stayed with him. This story is terrifying, not because of gore or violence, but because of how ordinary it began. Two people hiking, a strange feeling, a noise, a decision. That's it. No dramatic buildup, no obvious danger until it was almost too late. It's the kind of story that makes you rethink moments in your own life. Times when you felt uneasy for no clear reason. Times when you left a place early. Times when you chose caution over curiosity. You wonder how many of those moments mattered more than you ever realized. The scariest part isn't that they were near a killer. The scariest part is that they didn't know it at the time. They walked away believing they had narrowly avoided something unknown. Years later, they learned just how real that danger had been. Sometimes, the most frightening truths don't reveal themselves right away. Sometimes, they wait years, hiding in plain sight, until one sentence in an interview opens a door you wish had stayed closed. And once you know, once you understand how close you came, that knowledge never really leaves you. It just sits there, quiet and heavy, reminding you how fragile safety can be, and how thin the space is between an ordinary night and a nightmare that almost happened. About 10 years ago, 4 friends and I were sitting around late one night doing what bored people in their early 20s often do. We were scrolling through local stories and urban legends, half laughing at most of them, half secretly hoping one would feel real enough to be worth checking out. That's when we came across a story that immediately caught our attention. It was about a one-lane bridge somewhere out in rural Wisconsin. According to the story, back in the 1960s, a prom couple had been driving across the bridge late at night when an oncoming car forced them off the edge. Their car went into the water below, and they drowned. The story claimed that if you went there right at dusk, when the sun was just disappearing, and stood on the bridge looking down into the water, you could sometimes see the headlights of the submerged car glowing faintly beneath the surface. Some versions of the story even said you could see the girl still inside, still wearing her prom dress. We laughed at it at first. It sounded like classic small-town folklore. But the more we talked about it, the more curious we got. The bridge wasn't far from where we were, maybe a short drive. We didn't have anything else going on, and it felt harmless enough. We told ourselves we'd go, check it out, have a good scare, and then head back. So we piled into a car and drove out there as the sun was starting to drop lower in the sky. The area was exactly what you'd expect for rural Wisconsin. Long stretches of farmland, patches of dense forest, very few houses, and almost no traffic. When we finally reached the bridge, we immediately recognized it from the description. It really was still there, narrow and old, only wide enough for one car at a time. On one side of the bridge, there was a long, curving driveway that disappeared into the trees. At the end of it, partially hidden by the forest, you could just make out a massive building. It looked like a mansion, or maybe some kind of private estate. On the other side of the bridge was open farmland and more forest, stretching out quietly into the distance. We parked on the field side of the bridge, feeling a little uneasy, but still joking around. Nothing seemed out of place. It was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but at the time we brushed that off. Two of us, including me, decided to walk out to the middle of the bridge. The bridge wasn't very long, maybe 3-car lengths at most. The other two friends stayed closer to the road, laughing and making jokes, clearly not taking the whole thing too seriously. We stood there, leaning slightly over the side of the bridge, looking down into the water. The river below wasn't even really a river. It was more like a glorified stream, narrow and shallow-looking, moving slowly beneath us. The sun was just finishing its descent, and the sky was fading from orange to dark blue. We were there for maybe 6 minutes. And I mean that literally. Not half an hour. Not even 15 minutes. Just a few minutes, waiting to see if anything would happen. Nothing did. At least not at first. Then, all of a sudden, I felt this overwhelming sense of unease. It came out of nowhere. My stomach tightened, my chest felt heavy, and every instinct in my body started screaming that something was wrong. At the exact same moment, I heard a loud snapping sound coming from the driveway side of the bridge. It sounded like a thick branch breaking under someone's weight. I didn't stop to think. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even turn to explain. I just yelled, "Run," as loud as I could and took off toward the car. As I turned and started running, I glanced back toward the driveway. That's when I saw headlights burst into view. A truck came roaring down the driveway at full speed, its lights cutting through the darkness as it headed straight toward the bridge. At the same time, from downriver, near the direction of the mansion, I heard the sudden roar of a motor, not a car engine, something else, something closer to the water. Everything in me knew we were in danger. Thankfully, none of my friends hesitated. Nobody laughed. Nobody asked what was going on. The moment I ran, they all ran too. The two friends closest to the car jumped in immediately and started it up. The engine came to life just as me and the other friend were sprinting off the bridge toward the road. I was maybe 12 feet from the car when I looked back one last time toward the river. What I saw still haunts me. A boat had come flying up the water far faster than I would have thought possible in such a narrow stream. There were 5 people in it. All of them were dressed in black, wearing what looked like tactical clothing. They had hats on, flashlights in their hands, and I could clearly see guns. Before I could even fully process what I was seeing, they jumped out of the boat and came charging up the 6-foot embankment behind me. They moved with terrifying speed and coordination, like this was something they had done before. The two friends in the car started screaming at us to jump in through the windows. There wasn't time to open doors. There wasn't time to think. Me and my friend dove headfirst into the car through the open windows, scrambling over seats and each other as the engine revved. Behind us, the people from the boat were already sprinting toward the car. One of them stood out immediately. He was faster than anyone I have ever seen run in real life. It didn't look natural. It reminded me of that scene from Terminator 2 where the metal guy chases the car on foot, never slowing down, never stumbling, just closing the distance no matter how fast the car goes. The driver panicked and threw the car into reverse. By that point, the truck from the driveway had reached the bridge, effectively blocking the only forward exit. We were trapped between the truck in front of us and these armed people sprinting toward us from behind. The driver slammed the gas, still in reverse, tires screaming as the car shot backward down the road. I looked out the back window and saw the people still running after us. Not stopping, not shouting, not saying a single word. No commands, no warnings, no explanation, just pursuit. We gained enough distance that the driver was able to swing the car around at a curve in the road. The moment the car straightened out, he floored it. We sped away as fast as the car could go, hearts pounding, breathing ragged, nobody saying a word for what felt like forever. When we finally slowed down, none of us could make sense of what had just happened. Oh, so many things about it were wrong. There was no way they were police. Law enforcement would have announced themselves. They would have yelled commands. They wouldn't have silently tried to trap a group of people on a bridge using both a truck and a boat. Why were they there at all? Why were they armed? Why did they move so quickly, so efficiently, as if they had been waiting for someone to show up? And the timing made it even worse. We had only been on that bridge for a few minutes. Less than 10. How did they even know we were there? How did they get into position that fast, from 2 different directions? The idea that chilled me the most came later, after we'd had time to think about it. What if the story we read wasn't just a story? What if it was bait? What if the legend of the prom couple, the headlights in the water, the ghost in the dress, was something meant to draw people out there? Curious people, bored people, people who wouldn't think twice about walking onto a quiet bridge at dusk. I don't know what those people were doing out there. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't run when we did. And I don't know how close we came to something far worse. But I do know this. Whatever was happening on that bridge had nothing to do with ghosts. And every time I think back on that night, I'm grateful that my instincts kicked in when they did. Because if we had stayed even a minute longer, I don't think any of us would have made it home to tell this story. This is one of those stories that doesn't announce itself as horrifying when you're living it. At the time, it feels awkward, uncomfortable, strange in a way you can't quite put your finger on. It's only years later, when the truth finally comes out, that everything snaps into focus, and you realize just how close you were to something truly evil without ever knowing it. Growing up, I had a friend who lived about a 5-minute walk from my house. We'd known each other since we were both around 4 years old. Our families were close in that casual neighborhood way. We'd see each other all the time, spend afternoons together, show up at each other's houses without much warning. It was the kind of friendship that just existed naturally, without effort. As we got older, like most kids who grow up together, things shifted. When we were teenagers, we started developing crushes on each other. It felt innocent and exciting, that early kind of attraction where everything feels intense and important. Eventually, we started dating. It lasted about a year, give or take. Nothing dramatic, nothing toxic, just young people trying to figure themselves out. But even before we officially started dating, and definitely during the time we were together, something always felt off about her dad. Every time I went over to her house, he'd give me these looks. Sometimes they were just cold. Other times they were outright nasty. The kind of look that makes you feel unwelcome, like you've done something wrong even when you haven't. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself it was normal. Dads are protective, especially when their daughter is getting older and starting to date. I'd seen that dynamic in movies and heard people joke about it all the time. Still, there was something about his behavior that felt excessive. One time, he actually sat me down for a man-to-man talk. He gave me the whole speech about looking after his little princess, about respecting her, about how he wouldn't tolerate anyone hurting her. On the surface, it sounded like a typical fatherly warning, but the tone was intense in a way that made me uncomfortable. It didn't feel like concern. It felt controlling, possessive, almost threatening. Even back then, as a teenager without much life experience, I remember thinking it was a bit over the top. Something about it didn't sit right. But again, I didn't question it too much. I didn't have a reason to. Her family seemed normal, friendly, loving even. There were no obvious signs of dysfunction. No one ever hinted that something darker was happening behind closed doors. Eventually, we broke up. It wasn't dramatic or ugly. Life just took us in different directions. Not long after that, I moved to a different part of the country. Distance did what distance usually does. We lost touch. Years went by. I assumed she was living her life, just like I was trying to live mine. Then, completely out of the blue, she contacted me. It had been years since we'd spoken. I was surprised, but also curious. We caught up over messages at first, talking about where life had taken us. Eventually, she decided to come down and visit me. She drove a long way just to see me. That alone should have told me how much she needed that connection. But I didn't understand it at the time. When she arrived, we went out drinking. A lot. The kind of drinking where you're trying to drown something you don't want to face sober. By the end of the night, we were both very drunk. And that's when she finally opened up. What she told me still haunts me. She told me that her parents had divorced. That alone wasn't shocking. People get divorced all the time. But then she explained why. She said her dad had regularly raped and beaten her mother throughout their marriage. That was already more than my brain could easily process. I felt sick just hearing it. I couldn't reconcile that information with the man I remembered, the one who played the role of strict but involved dad. Then she told me the rest. She said her dad had also regularly raped her. It started when she was around 5 years old. 5. He continued abusing her for years. Not once. Not occasionally. Regularly. It only stopped when she was around 14 or 15 when he lost interest. Hearing those words come out of her mouth felt like being punched in the chest. I couldn't breathe properly. My mind just kept looping on the number. 5 years old. A child. His own daughter. I remember sitting there, drunk, but suddenly horrifyingly sober, trying to make sense of it. Every memory I had of her childhood, every time I'd been in that house, every family gathering, every normal moment we'd shared, replayed in my head with a completely different meaning. All those times I'd been over there. All those dinners. All those afternoons hanging out. All those moments where her dad was in the room acting normal, smiling, talking, playing the role of a father. And all the while, he was doing unimaginable things when no one was looking. It shattered my understanding of reality. What haunted me most wasn't just what he did. It was how invisible it all was. Her family and mine were pretty close. Our parents talked. We visited each other. None of us suspected a thing. There were no rumors, no obvious signs, no whispered concerns. Nothing that would have made anyone step in. He hid it perfectly. And that's the part that still keeps me up sometimes. The idea that someone can commit that level of violence and cruelty for years and still blend into everyday life so completely. That they can sit across from you at a table, give speeches about protecting their daughter, glare at teenage boys with fake concern, all while being the very person who is destroying her. Looking back, those looks he gave me make sense now. That over-the-top protectiveness, that intensity, it wasn't about keeping her safe. It was about control, about ownership, about making sure no one got close enough to notice something was wrong. I think about how close I was to her during that time, how we dated, how we cared about each other, and how little I knew about the reality of her life. It breaks my heart to think about what she was carrying alone, while still trying to be a normal kid, a normal teenager. Someone who laughed, joked, went to school, and dated like nothing was wrong. I also think about how many adults failed her. Neighbors, family friends, teachers, relatives. All of us who saw her regularly and didn't see the signs, or maybe didn't know what signs to look for. It's terrifying to realize how easily abuse can hide behind closed doors, especially when the abuser is someone society automatically trusts, like a parent. After that night, after she told me everything, I couldn't look at my memories the same way again. Childhood felt less innocent. The world felt less safe. I started questioning how many other stories like this exist, buried under years of silence and shame. What stayed with me most was her matter-of-fact tone when she talked about it. Not because it didn't affect her, but because she'd lived with it for so long that it had become part of her reality. Something she had survived rather than something she was still shocked by. That, more than anything, showed how deep the damage went. Even now, years later, I still think about her. I wonder how she's doing. If she ever found peace. If she ever felt truly safe. If she managed to build a life where that man no longer has power over her, even in memory. And I think about her dad, not in a curious way, in a sickened, angry way. The kind of anger that comes from knowing that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like strict fathers. Sometimes they give man-to-man talks. Sometimes they sit at family tables and smile. That's what scares me the most. Not the obvious threats, not the strangers in dark alleys, but the people who live next door, the people everyone trusts, the people who know exactly how to play their role. This story still haunts me because it taught me a hard truth far too clearly. You never really know what's happening behind closed doors. You never fully know the people you think you know. And sometimes, the most dangerous people, are the ones hiding in plain sight, wrapped in the mask of normality. I wish I could say I saw it coming. I wish I could say there were signs I ignored. But the truth is, there weren't any obvious ones. And that realization is terrifying in its own way. It's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. This story was told to me secondhand through a friend about someone she knew. Even though it didn't happen to me directly, it's one of those stories that crawls into your mind and refuses to leave. Not because of violence, not because of blood or screams, but because of how quiet it was, how controlled, how close it came to becoming something much worse. A friend of a friend was living in a shared house. She had roommates, and usually the house was busy, full of noise and movement, people coming and going. But on this particular day, she was alone. Her roommates were out. It wasn't unusual. It was just one of those normal, forgettable days that didn't feel dangerous at all. At some point, she realized something was wrong. She heard noises that didn't belong. Not the normal creaks of a house settling, not the sound of a roommate moving around, but something sharper. Footsteps. voices, movement that didn't feel casual or familiar. It took her a few moments to understand what was happening, and when it finally clicked, fear hit her all at once. Her house was being broken into. There were a few guys, not just one. She could hear more than one voice, more than one set of footsteps. They were moving through the house, opening drawers, shifting objects, clearly looking for things to steal. She was frozen in her room, heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. She didn't know what to do. She didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She didn't try to run. In her mind, she made a decision very quickly, driven by pure survival instinct rather than logic. She assumed they were there to steal things. TVS, laptops, anything valuable they could carry. She told herself that if she stayed quiet, if she didn't alert them to her presence, they would take what they wanted and leave. So she pretended to be asleep. She lay completely still in her bed. She controlled her breathing as best she could. She didn't move a muscle. Every second felt stretched out and unreal, like time had slowed down just to torture her. Then she heard footsteps coming toward her room. Someone opened her door. She could hear him inside her room now. A man. She could hear him moving around. She could hear drawers opening, objects being picked up and set down. He was going through her things, her personal belongings, things that belonged only to her, things that told a story about who she was, where she slept, how she lived. She stayed still. Her body was screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she forced herself not to react. She kept her eyes closed. She tried to look relaxed, like she was deeply asleep and completely unaware of what was happening around her. Every moment felt unbearable. She didn't know how long he was in the room. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. In situations like that, time loses meaning. All that existed was fear and the sound of a stranger moving through her space. Eventually, she heard him stop. She thought maybe he was leaving. She thought maybe it was over. Then she felt him come closer to the bed. She felt the shift in the air. That subtle change you can sense when someone enters your personal space. He leaned down, close enough that she could feel his presence right beside her face. Close enough that she could smell him, feel the warmth of his breath. And then he whispered into her ear, "I know that you're not asleep." Those words alone are horrifying, not shouted, not threatening, just calm, certain. As if he had known the whole time, as if her act hadn't fooled him for even a second. She did nothing. She didn't react. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't scream. She stayed frozen, pretending to be asleep even after he exposed that he knew she wasn't. After whispering that, he stood up and left the room. That was it. He didn't touch her. He didn't hurt her. He didn't say anything else. He simply walked out. The other guys finished stealing whatever they wanted from the house, and then they all left. And she was left alone in her room, shaking, alive but deeply changed. I don't know if the men were ever caught. I don't know if the police were called afterward, or if she was too traumatized to report it. I don't know how she processed it in the days, weeks, or years that followed. All I know is the moment itself, because that moment is enough to haunt anyone who hears it. What makes this story so chilling isn't just the break-in. Break-ins happen. They're terrifying, yes, but they usually follow a pattern people understand. Someone wants your things. You hide. They leave. What makes this different is that whisper. That whisper changes everything. It means he knew she was there. It means he chose not to hurt her. It means he wanted her to know that he knew. And that is deeply unsettling. It raises questions with no comforting answers. Why did he say it? Was it a power move? Was it meant to scare her? Was it a warning? Was it restraint? The fact that he leaned down so close, invaded her space so completely, and then left without explanation, is what turns this from a crime into something that feels almost predatory in a psychological sense. He didn't need to whisper. He could have said nothing. He could have just left. But he wanted her to know. He wanted to leave something behind that wasn't physical. A memory, a fear, a reminder of how vulnerable she was and how aware he was of that vulnerability. It's the kind of thing that doesn't leave bruises but still scars you. I often think about what it must have been like for her afterward. How do you sleep in that room again? How do you lie in that same bed without replaying the moment over and over? How do you feel safe in a place that was violated so completely? Even if she moved out, the fear wouldn't just disappear. It would follow her into new homes, new rooms, new nights. Every unfamiliar sound would trigger that memory. Every creak, every footstep outside, every unexpected noise in the dark. And there's another layer that makes it even worse. He left, which means he made a choice. He could have hurt her. He could have done something far worse. And the fact that he didn't doesn't make it comforting. In some ways, it makes it more disturbing, because it means the outcome depended entirely on his decision in that moment. Her safety wasn't guaranteed by walls or locks or neighbors or laws. It was granted temporarily by a stranger who had already proven he was capable of violating boundaries. That kind of realization can destroy your sense of control. You realize how thin the line is between safety and danger, how much of life is built on assumptions that can collapse in seconds, how easily someone else's choices can define your fate. What chills me the most is imagining the silence afterward. The house empty, the door closed, the sound of footsteps gone. Sitting there alone, not knowing if it was really over or if they might come back, and knowing that someone had been close enough to whisper in your ear. That closeness is intimate in the worst possible way. This story doesn't end with justice or resolution. There's no satisfying conclusion. Just a moment that lingers, unresolved, hanging in the air like a shadow. And that's why it stays with me, because it reminds you that some of the most terrifying things don't happen loudly. They happen quietly, calmly, with control. And sometimes the scariest part isn't what someone does. It's what they choose not to do, and how clearly they let you know that choice was theirs. That thought alone is enough to chill you to the bone. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. I had a friend for a few years who I met online, but she lived close enough that she eventually became part of my real, physical life, too. Our friendship was never intense in a daily sense. We didn't talk constantly. We would check in with each other, drift apart for a while, then reconnect like nothing had changed. It felt easy, familiar, low pressure. Over time, the relationship blurred in the way some friendships do. We flirted, we sexted a few times. There was chemistry, but it never fully turned into anything serious. We hooked up once, but even that didn't shift the dynamic much. It just became another quiet layer between us that we never really named. One night, we made plans. I was supposed to pick her up and bring her back to my place so we could hang out and spend the night together. It wasn't some big event. Just another casual plan between two people who trusted each other. And then I flaked. That wasn't unusual for me back then. I flaked on plans a lot. Sometimes because I was tired. Sometimes because I didn't feel like dealing with people. Sometimes because I just didn't have the emotional energy to show up. I told myself there would always be another time. That night there wasn't. Her roommate strangled her to death after an argument. As far as anyone could tell, it wasn't planned. It wasn't something people had been warning about. He didn't have a long history of violence that everyone ignored. It seemed like something inside him broke or snapped in that moment, and she happened to be there. I remember finding out and feeling like the air had been sucked out of my chest. The first reaction wasn't even sadness. It was disbelief. Like my brain refused to line up the facts in the right order. She was alive. We had plans. I didn't go. She was gone. People say things like, you can't blame yourself in situations like this, and logically, I know that's true. I know with my rational mind that if it hadn't happened that night, it likely would have happened another night. Another argument, another moment, another victim. But logic doesn't erase the truth that if I hadn't flaked, she would have lived at least one more day. That thought never fully goes away. It doesn't scream. It just sits there quietly in the background, resurfacing when I least expect it. A simple what if that has no resolution. Not long after that, another friend died. Our relationship wasn't identical, but it was similar in shape. We talked. We flirted lightly. There was a closeness there that never fully crossed into a defined relationship, but it mattered to both of us. She had a boyfriend at the time. He had just asked her to marry him. He was a veteran, intense, protective in a way that sometimes bordered on controlling. She was a sex worker, and he absolutely hated that part of her life. We talked about it more than once. She admitted he could be a little problematic, a little too intense, but she also talked about how much she loved him. In the weeks leading up to her death, we had gotten closer. Not in a romantic sense, but emotionally. She confided in me more. She talked openly about her future, about feeling conflicted but excited. The day before it happened, we had a long conversation about the engagement. She told me she never thought she wanted marriage, never thought she was ready for something like that, but decided to dive in anyway. She said she was planning to leave sex work and start a different life. The next day, he snapped. He held her hostage in their garage for hours. Then he shot her in the head with a shotgun. After that, he killed himself. There are no words that fully capture what that feels like to hear. The brutality of it, the intimacy of it, the way love, control, fear, and violence can collapse into a single moment. I try not to think too deeply about that one. I know there are lines of thought that would take me somewhere unhealthy if I followed them too far. Questions without answers. Imagining different choices. Wondering if conversations mattered more than they seemed at the time. I've learned to stop myself when my mind starts drifting there. Then there's the third friend. She and I had a relationship that followed the same familiar pattern. Talking, flirting, mutual understanding, a sense of closeness that didn't need labels. One night, she got drunk and passed out in her yard. There were friends inside the house, but no one noticed. No one checked on her. She froze to death. What makes that one especially hard to sit with is what happened at the same time in my own life. That very same night, I also got completely fucked up and passed out in my backyard. The weather was almost identical. I was 17. I had taken 9 grams of mushrooms and smoked a blunt on my back porch. I was hiding the trip from my mom, so once I stumbled back inside, I stayed in my room with a friend for the entire duration. I was outside for so long that when I finally came to, my body was so numb that I was convinced I was dead. Not metaphorically, not dramatically, literally convinced. I couldn't feel a single inch of myself. No hands, no feet, no chest rising and falling. I was completely detached from my body. Time didn't exist. Sound felt distant and wrong. I remember thinking that this was what death must feel like, and accepting it in a strangely calm way. That feeling lasted for hours. I stayed in that room for about 16 hours until the trip finally wore off and I slowly re-entered the world. Even then, it took time before I trusted that I was alive. As soon as the trip ended, I found out my friend had died. Same night, same weather, same basic scenario. One of us survived, one of us didn't. That coincidence alone is enough to mess with your head. All three deaths happened within about a year or two of each other. We all knew each other. We ran in the same circles, same parties, same late-night conversations, same shared spaces. Sometimes it feels unreal that so much loss could concentrate itself into such a small slice of time. Sometimes it feels like I slipped through something that was meant to take me too. What sticks with me most isn't just the violence or the tragedy. It's the randomness, the way life hinges on such small, ordinary decisions. Flaking on plans, staying inside, choosing one night over another. How survival sometimes has nothing to do with being smarter or stronger, and everything to do with timing. There's also guilt. Not loud guilt, but quiet, persistent guilt. The kind that doesn't accuse you outright, but asks questions you can never answer. The kind that reminds you how thin the line is between being here and not being here. I don't talk about this much, not because I'm ashamed, but because it's hard to put into words without it sounding dramatic or self-centered. These weren't my deaths. I didn't suffer the way they did. And yet these experiences shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until years later. They made me hyper-aware of how fragile people are, how quickly situations can turn, how often we assume there will be more time. They also left me with a strange relationship to fate and chance. I don't believe in destiny in a traditional sense, but I can't ignore how close some of these moments came to overlapping completely. How easily the story could have been written with my name in it instead. Sometimes I think about the people they could have become, the conversations we never had, the lives that just stopped. Other times I try not to think about it at all. I don't know if anyone will read this. I don't know if it even matters if they do. But writing it out feels like acknowledging something I've carried quietly for a long time. These stories don't have lessons wrapped neatly at the end. They don't resolve. They just exist. Like scars you don't always see, but feel when the weather changes. All I know is that I'm still here. And some days, that fact alone feels heavy. A friend of my mother has spent most of his adult life around the sea. From his early 20s, he built a career organizing sailing trips and extreme sports vacations. It wasn't just a job for him, it was his passion. He lived and breathed the ocean. He knew boats, currents, weather, and coastlines the way some people know city streets. By the time he was in his 30s, he had years of experience behind him, and a reputation for being careful, professional, and calm under pressure. That experience is important to understand because this wasn't a reckless or careless man. He wasn't someone who took unnecessary risks or ignored danger signs. If anything, he was known for being cautious, especially when other people's lives were involved. That's part of what makes this story so unsettling. At some point in his 30s, a couple booked one of his sailing trips. They presented themselves as experienced sailors. They spoke confidently about the sea, used the right terminology, and seemed knowledgeable enough that nothing about them raised immediate concern. They weren't teenagers chasing thrills or tourists with no understanding of how dangerous open water can be. They appeared calm, mature, and capable. The plan was a sailing trip from the Netherlands to France. It wasn't an unusual route for him. He had done similar journeys before, and while the sea always demands respect, there was nothing about the trip itself that seemed especially dangerous on paper. The weather was decent, the vessel was in good condition, and everything felt routine. As they sailed toward the northern coast of France, things remained calm. The water wasn't violent. The sky wasn't threatening, and nothing felt out of control. About 5 kilometers west of the French coast, the couple suggested stopping. They told him they knew the waters in that area very well. They said they wanted to go for a swim. This is where hindsight becomes cruel. He hesitated, but not for long. The couple spoke with confidence and assurance. They didn't seem unsure or impulsive. They didn't give the impression of people underestimating the ocean. Based on their apparent experience and the conditions at the time, he agreed. He cast the anchor. They entered the water. At first, everything seemed normal. The boat was steady. The sea moved gently around them. There was no immediate sense of danger. He stayed close, watching them, aware of his responsibility as the organizer and captain. Then something changed. He couldn't say exactly when or how it happened. One moment he could see the couple in the water. The next, they were gone. Not drifting slowly away, not calling out, just gone. Almost at the same time, he realized something far worse. He couldn't see the boat either. The current had taken it. The anchor had not held the way it was supposed to, or the water movement was stronger beneath the surface than it appeared from above. In open water, especially near coastlines, conditions can be deceiving. What looks calm on the surface can be powerful and deadly underneath. In what felt like a single minute, everything was gone. The boat, the couple, his only lifeline. He was alone in the ocean. At first, shock took over. That moment when your brain refuses to accept what just happened. He turned in every direction, searching for the boat, calling out, hoping to see a shape, a shadow, anything. He listened for voices, splashing, movement. There was nothing, just open water. The realization hit him slowly and then all at once. He was kilometers from shore, with no flotation device, no support, and no idea where the others had gone. Panic tried to take over, but years of experience forced him to push it down. Panic wastes energy. Panic kills. He made a decision. He chose a direction and started swimming. He didn't know if it was the shortest route. He didn't know if the current would help or fight him. He only knew that staying still meant death. He focused on movement, rhythm, and breathing. Stroke after stroke, minute after minute. Time lost meaning out there. The sun moved slowly across the sky. His muscles burned, then went numb, then burned again. Salt water dried his mouth and lips. His throat ached from swallowing water. Every breath became harder than the last. His arms felt heavy, like they no longer belonged to him. At some point, he realized he had been swimming for hours. He tried not to think about the couple. He tried not to imagine what might have happened to them. Thinking about others wouldn't help him survive. He focused only on the next stroke, the next breath, the next moment. The ocean doesn't care how strong you are. It doesn't care how experienced you think you are. It doesn't care how confident you felt 5 minutes earlier. It simply exists, vast and indifferent. After what he later estimated to be around 5 hours of swimming, he saw land. At first, it didn't feel real. Many people who are lost at sea hallucinate coastlines that aren't there. He forced himself to stay cautious, to make sure what he was seeing wasn't his mind giving him false hope. But it was real. The shoreline slowly grew clearer. The shape of the land sharpened. The water beneath him began to feel different as it shallowed. When his feet finally touched the ground, his body almost gave out completely. He collapsed onto the beach. He doesn't remember much of what happened immediately after that. He remembers voices. He remembers hands. He remembers being cold and shaking uncontrollably. His body was completely spent, pushed far beyond its limits. He woke up in a hospital. He stayed there for 2 weeks. Dehydration, exhaustion, muscle damage. His body had been pushed to the edge of what it could survive. Doctors told him that if he had been in the water much longer, he likely wouldn't have made it. And during those 2 weeks, he asked about the couple. There was no good news. Search efforts were made, but the sea had already taken too much time. Their bodies were never found. Not long after, they were officially declared dead. He never saw them again. That knowledge weighed heavily on him. Even though he survived, the experience left scars far deeper than physical ones. He replayed the moment again and again, the decision to trust them, the choice to anchor, the minute when everything changed. People often talk about respecting the ocean as a vague idea. This story gave that phrase a brutal, literal meaning. The sea does not forgive mistakes. It does not warn you loudly before it takes control. It doesn't need storms or towering waves to become deadly. Sometimes it only needs confidence, calm weather, and a single bad decision. What makes this story especially disturbing is how quickly it all happened. There was no long buildup, no dramatic signs, no obvious danger. One moment, everything was fine. The next, lives were gone. The couple believed they knew the water. They believed their experience protected them. And maybe they truly did have experience. But the ocean doesn't care about what you think you know. For my mother's friend, this experience changed him. He continued working around the sea, but never in the same way. He became even more cautious, more skeptical, more aware of how fragile safety really is out there. For me, hearing this story left a permanent impression. It taught me that the ocean is not like a lake or a pool. Unknown waters are exactly that, unknown. Currents, tides, and underwater conditions can change everything without warning. Confidence can turn into disaster in seconds. When people disappear at sea, it often feels abstract to those who hear about it later. A headline, a statistic. But this story made it painfully real. It showed how close survival and death can be, separated by nothing more than a few minutes and a shifting current. Even now, whenever I see calm water stretching out to the horizon, I think of this story. I think of how peaceful it must have looked that day. I think of how quickly peace turned into terror. And I remember that the ocean doesn't need to look dangerous to be deadly. That lesson stays with you. Respect the sea. Question confidence. And never assume that calm water means safety. This is one of those stories that feels like a chain reaction, where one moment of carelessness sets off a series of events that ruins multiple lives, one after another. What makes it so disturbing isn't just the deaths themselves, but how senseless and preventable so much of it was. It's the kind of story that sticks with you because it shows how quickly things can spiral, and how tragedy doesn't always stop with the first loss. Someone I knew died in a way that still feels unreal to think about. It happened at night. He lived in an apartment building several stories high, and like many people, he had a habit of stepping out onto his balcony to smoke a cigarette before going to bed. It was something he had done countless times. It was routine, comfortable, familiar. He wasn't reckless or careless by nature. This was just part of his normal life. What he didn't remember, or maybe wasn't fully aware of in that moment, was that the building was undergoing renovations. The balconies were being worked on. The railings had been removed. Instead of a solid barrier, there was only yellow danger tape stretched across the open edge. The kind of tape you see everywhere. The kind that signals caution, but doesn't physically stop anything. In daylight, it might have been obvious. At night, especially when you're tired and doing something automatic, it was a deadly trap. He stepped onto the balcony in the dark. He leaned forward to look out at the city lights, probably expecting the familiar resistance of the railing, something solid to rest his weight against, something that had always been there before. There was nothing. He fell 8 stories. There was no chance to grab onto anything, no second to understand what was happening. Just open air and gravity, the kind of fall that gives you no time to react, no chance to survive. He died instantly. His body wasn't found until the next morning. That detail is especially haunting. While he lay dead outside the building, his girlfriend was still inside their apartment, asleep in bed. She had no idea what had happened. No idea that he never came back inside. No idea that the person she loved was gone. When they found him, he was naked. That detail isn't included for shock value, but because it makes the situation feel even more vulnerable and tragic. He wasn't doing anything dramatic or dangerous. He wasn't dressed to go out. He was at home, in what should have been the safest place in the world. The shock of his death rippled outward. His adult daughter was devastated, but her grief quickly turned into anger. And in some ways, that anger made sense. The renovation work had been careless. Removing balcony railings and replacing them with nothing more than tape was dangerous. Anyone could see that in hindsight. She sued the contractor responsible for the renovations. She won. The settlement was large, life-changing money. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Instead of using the money to stabilize her life, to build something safer for herself and her family, she spiraled. The sudden influx of cash didn't heal her grief. It amplified her worst impulses. She began partying heavily, drinking constantly, living without limits. She already had 3 children. And as her behavior worsened, she lost custody of them. That alone would have been tragic enough. A family already fractured by death becoming even more broken. Children losing not just a grandfather, but effectively losing their mother too. But it didn't end there. One evening, she got behind the wheel drunk. This wasn't a near miss. This wasn't a wake-up call where everyone walked away shaken but alive. This was the worst possible outcome. She crashed into another car. Inside that car was a couple. They were expecting a baby. All 3 of them died. The couple and the unborn child they were about to welcome into the world. 3 lives ended in an instant because someone chose to drive while intoxicated. When the case went to court, she pleaded guilty. There was no denying what she had done. The evidence was clear. The damage was irreversible. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. 6 years. When you think about it, that number feels almost meaningless compared to the lives lost. 2 adults with futures, plans, relationships. A baby who never even had a chance to be born. Families on both sides left shattered, and now she's probably out. That's another unsettling part. Time passes, sentences end, People move on, at least legally, but the consequences don't disappear. The families of the victims don't get their loved ones back. The children she lost custody of still grow up with that legacy hanging over them. Looking back at the whole chain of events, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by how senseless it all was. A missing railing, a moment of habit, a fall, a lawsuit, money, addiction, another reckless decision, another crash, more deaths. Each step feels connected, like dominoes falling one after another. If even one thing had been different, maybe the rest wouldn't have happened. If the contractor had installed proper barriers, if he had turned on a light, if she had handled her grief differently, if she hadn't driven that night. But that's the cruel part of reality. You don't get to rewind and fix things. What makes this story especially disturbing is how ordinary it all starts. There's nothing dramatic or unusual about someone stepping onto their balcony for a cigarette. There's nothing shocking about renovation work in an apartment building. These are normal parts of everyday life. And yet, the outcome was catastrophic. It's a reminder of how fragile safety really is, how much we rely on assumptions, how we trust that things like railings will always be there, that danger will always look obvious, that consequences will stop after the first tragedy. They don't. Tragedy compounds. It spreads. It affects people who had nothing to do with the original event. Innocent people, completely disconnected from that balcony and that fall, ended up dead years later because of decisions made in the aftermath. There's also something deeply unsettling about the randomness of it all. The girlfriend sleeping peacefully while her partner lay dead outside. The children losing custody because grief turned to self-destruction. The expecting couple driving on a normal evening, never knowing they were about to cross paths with someone whose life had already been derailed by a completely unrelated accident. Stories like this don't have clean morals or satisfying endings. They just leave you with questions. How many lives can one moment of negligence destroy? How often do we underestimate how dangerous temporary solutions really are? How many people are walking around right now carrying grief that could explode into something far worse if left unchecked? And how thin is the line between routine and disaster? Whenever I think about this story, I find myself paying more attention to small details, railings, barriers, warning signs, things I used to assume were just there to cover liability, not because real danger existed. And I think about how grief, when mixed with money, power, or substances, can turn into something uncontrollable. How easily pain can be passed down or outward, hurting people who had nothing to do with the original loss. This isn't a ghost story. There's nothing supernatural about it. And that's exactly what makes it so terrifying. It's real. It could happen anywhere. And it shows how one preventable mistake can echo for years, leaving destruction far beyond the moment it began. My cousin told me this story one evening, almost casually at first, like she wasn't sure whether she believed it herself. The more she talked, the quieter she got, and by the time she finished, the room felt heavy. This happened in 2018, during a period of her life when she was living alone, far north in Alaska. And when I say far north, I mean extremely remote. The kind of place where towns are hours apart, roads are unreliable, and help is never close. The kind of place where silence feels alive and isolation isn't just emotional, it's physical. She had gone up there for work and solitude. She wanted space from people, from noise, from everything that felt overwhelming in normal life. She rented a small house on a stretch of land surrounded by forest, snow, and endless sky. There were neighbors, technically, but they were far apart. You could live an entire week without seeing another human being if you didn't make the effort to drive into town. At first, she loved it. The quiet felt healing. The land felt powerful and old, like it existed on its own rules. But after a while, things started to feel off. There was a man who lived east of her property, about an hour away by car. She had never met him face to face, but she became aware of him through small, unsettling interactions. It started with radio chatter. They both used the same local radio frequency, which wasn't unusual in that area. People used it to communicate about weather, wildlife sightings, or road conditions. At first, his voice would come through occasionally, making comments that felt unnecessary. He would ask where she was headed. He would comment on her being alone. Nothing overtly threatening at first, just intrusive. The kind of comments that make your skin crawl without giving you a clear reason why. Over time, it escalated. He began referring to her directly, even when she hadn't spoken on the radio. He seemed to know when she was home and when she wasn't. He talked about her land as if it wasn't hers, as if he had some claim over it. He would mention boundaries and property lines in vague, confusing ways. My cousin is not someone who panics easily. She's strong, practical, and not prone to exaggeration. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was mentally unwell. Maybe this was just how people were out there, isolated for too long. But then the tone changed. One evening, his voice came through the radio again, this time angry. He was ranting. His words were slurred and erratic, like someone spiraling deeper into something dark. He started talking about promiscuous girls being on his property. He talked about respect, about punishment, about people who didn't belong where they were. That's when fear truly set in. Because my cousin owned her land, legally, properly. There was no confusion about that. And yet here was a man, an hour away, armed with a gun, talking like she was trespassing on something that belonged to him. She tried not to engage. She turned off the radio. She locked her doors. She kept a weapon nearby, just in case. That night, she barely slept. Every sound outside felt amplified. The wind against the walls, the branches moving, the distant howl of animals. The next day, she made a decision. She drove into town. It wasn't a quick drive. It took time, and every mile felt tense. She kept checking her mirrors, half expecting to see another vehicle following her. When she finally reached town, she went straight to the local authorities and asked to speak with an officer. She explained everything, the radio messages, the harassment, the threats, the mention of a gun. She told the officer where the man supposedly lived, east of her property, about an hour out. She described his voice as best she could and explained how unsafe she felt. The officer listened quietly, without interrupting. Then, after she finished, he said something that made her stomach drop. He told her that the man she was describing had died 2 years earlier. At first, she thought he was mistaken. She corrected him, insisting that this man was alive. She had heard him, repeatedly, recently. The officer didn't look surprised. He didn't argue. He told her that this wasn't the first time he'd heard this story. According to the officer, the man had been known for harassing residents in that area. He had bothered the people who lived on her property before she ever arrived. He had made threats. He had frightened people. And then, 2 years earlier, he had died. There was no East Side neighbor anymore. There was no one living there. My cousin said the room felt like it tilted when she heard that. Like reality shifted just enough to make her doubt everything she thought she understood. She asked how it was possible. The officer didn't offer an explanation. He just told her that she wasn't the first person to come in scared. Describing the same voice, the same words, the same threats, she asked what she should do. The officer told her the truth in a way that felt both honest and terrifying. He said that living that far out, alone, wasn't safe for her anymore. Not because of wildlife, not because of weather, but because isolation can do strange things to people. And sometimes things happen out there that don't make sense. She went back to her house that day only to pack what she absolutely needed. She didn't stay another night. She didn't turn on the radio again. She said the silence felt different after that conversation. Heavier, like it was listening. Within a short time, she left Alaska entirely. She came to stay permanently with me and my wife in the lower states. She didn't talk about Alaska much after that. When she did, it was brief. She avoided details. She avoided thinking about it. But every once in a while, usually late at night, she would say something small that reminded me how deeply that experience shook her. She would mention the radio, or how she still hates complete silence, or how she never feels comfortable living alone anymore. She never claimed it was a ghost. She never said anything supernatural outright. She just told the story exactly as it happened, exactly as it was explained to her. And that's what makes it so disturbing. There's no clean explanation, no clear villain you can point to and say, that's it. Whether it was something psychological, something environmental, or something we don't understand at all, the fear was real. The threat felt real. And the decision she made likely saved her from something far worse, even if we don't know what that something was. That story taught me something important about isolation, about how being far away from people doesn't just remove noise and stress, it also removes safety nets. There's no one to hear you scream, no one to check in on you, no one to confirm whether what you're experiencing is real or not. And it taught me to respect places like that. There are parts of the world that don't care if you understand them. Places that existed long before us and will exist long after. Places where stories don't always end with answers. My cousin is safe now. She has a home. She has people around her. She laughs again. But Alaska changed her. And every time she tells that story, I can hear it in her voice. Whatever was speaking to her through that radio, alive or not, human or not, it was enough to drive her away from one of the most remote places on Earth. And sometimes, that's the only warning you get. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, my family and I used to spend every summer at my grandparents' house in the countryside. It was something I looked forward to all year. Their house was big and made of wood, the kind of house that creaks and breathes when the wind moves through it. It had 2 floors and was surrounded by forest on almost all sides. Trees everywhere, tall and dense, the kind that block out sound and light once the sun starts going down. At that time, my grandparents had only recently gotten electricity installed. They had electric panels and artificial lights, but everything still felt old-fashioned. Most of the time the lights were on, especially in the evenings, because the house could get very dark very quickly. Even with electricity, it still felt like a place from another era. They still kept candles around from before the lights were installed, and a lot of the furniture and layout of the house hadn't changed in decades. One afternoon, we were all sitting together having dinner. I remember it clearly because the light outside had that golden color. It gets late in the day, when everything feels calm and slow. During dinner, my grandmother started telling a story. She spoke in a very casual way, like she was talking about the weather or something that happened a long time ago. She told me about a family that had lived somewhere in the forest near our house. According to her, the family had consisted of 2 parents and 2 children. One day, their house caught on fire and burned down completely. None of them survived. She said that after the fire, people claimed that their souls never found peace. She told me that they still wandered through the forest looking for a new place to rest, unable to leave the area where they had died. As she spoke, I remember feeling a strange mix of fear and fascination. She wasn't dramatic about it. Well, she didn't lower her voice or try to scare me on purpose. That almost made it worse. It sounded like something she truly believed or had heard many times before. My mom immediately stepped in and told me not to believe it. She said it was just an old story people told children to scare them. She laughed it off and told my grandmother not to fill my head with nonsense. I nodded, but deep down, I didn't believe my mom. I was a kid, and stories like that stuck to me easily. Once the idea was in my head, I couldn't get rid of it. And for the rest of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I looked out toward the forest, I imagined shapes between the trees. I imagined people walking slowly through the woods, searching for something. By the time night came, my imagination was completely out of control. When it was time to go to sleep, I lay in bed on the second floor, staring at the ceiling. The house made its usual nighttime noises, wood popping, the sound of the wind brushing against the walls. Far away, maybe an animal moving in the forest. Normally, those sounds didn't bother me, but that night they felt different. Everything felt heavier. I couldn't sleep. My mouth felt dry, and I decided I wanted a glass of water. The problem was the lights. If I turned them on upstairs, I would wake my parents. The light would be too bright, and the door was open. Closing the door would make that loud squeaking noise it always made, and I knew for sure someone would wake up. I noticed one of the old candles sitting nearby. My grandparents kept them around even though they didn't really use them anymore. For a moment, I thought about using it, but then I realized there was nothing nearby to light it with. No matches, no lighter. I stood there for a while, debating what to do. In the end, I decided it would be better to just go downstairs in the dark. I knew the house well. I had walked those stairs 100 times. I told myself there was nothing to be afraid of. I stepped quietly down the stairs, holding onto the railing. The house felt different at night, especially without lights. The darkness wasn't total, but it was thick. Shadows filled the corners, and everything looked unfamiliar even though it wasn't. When I reached the ground floor, the first thing I noticed was that the front door was open. That immediately made me uneasy. My grandparents were very careful about locking doors at night, even in the countryside. I stood there for a moment, listening. I didn't hear anything. No voices, no footsteps. I slowly closed the door. The sound of it clicking shut echoed louder than I expected in the quiet house. My heart was beating faster now, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had forgotten to close it earlier. I walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was large, with a table placed in the corner of the room. That corner didn't get much light, even during the day. At night, it was almost completely dark. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my entire body freeze. There was a dark figure standing near the table. It wasn't moving. It was just there. In that moment, my brain immediately tried to make sense of it. I thought it was my grandpa. He often woke up at night, and maybe he had come down for water, too. The figure was about the right height. That explanation felt safe, so I grabbed onto it. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't ask who it was. I just went to the sink, filled a glass of water, and drank it as quickly as I could. I was very aware of the presence behind me, even though I didn't look directly at it. After I finished drinking, I turned slightly and said, "Good night," assuming my grandpa was there. There was no response, but I didn't wait for one. I walked back toward the stairs and went upstairs as quietly as possible. Once I was back in bed, I pulled the covers over myself and lay there, wide awake. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that it was just my grandpa standing in the kitchen. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. For years after that, I didn't really think about it. The memory faded into the background, just another strange childhood moment. Life went on. I grew older. I stopped believing in ghost stories the way children do. Then, 1 or 2 years ago, that memory came back to me out of nowhere. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe a conversation. Maybe a dream. But suddenly, I remembered that summer in detail. The house, the story my grandmother told. The night I went downstairs in the dark. Out of curiosity, I decided to look into the story about the burned house. I didn't expect to find anything. I honestly thought it would turn out to be just a local legend or something exaggerated over time, but it wasn't. I found records about a house that had burned down in the forest near my grandparents' property. A family had lived there, 2 parents, 2 children. They had all died in the fire. When I read that, my stomach dropped. At first, I was just shocked. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to process what I was reading. Then the fear started creeping in. Not a sudden panic, but a slow, cold realization. That night in the kitchen came rushing back to me. I started questioning everything. Was the front door really open? Or did my memory exaggerate it? Was the figure really there? Or was I just tired and scared because of the story I had heard earlier? Why didn't the figure respond when I said goodnight? Why didn't I ever see my grandpa in the kitchen when I thought about it later? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I haven't told anyone this story until now. Every time I think about sharing it, I stop myself. It sounds too easy to dismiss. People would say I was half asleep, that my imagination filled in the gaps, that children see things in the dark all the time. And maybe they're right. But the problem is how real it felt, how clear the memory still is, how the timing of everything lines up. The story at dinner, the open door, the figure in the darkest corner of the kitchen, the silence. Even now, I don't claim to know what I saw. I don't say it was a ghost or something supernatural for sure. But I also can't fully convince myself it was nothing. What scares me the most is not the idea of spirits wandering the forest. It's the idea that sometimes, as children, we might witness things we don't yet have the language or understanding to process. Things we explain away because that's the only way we can cope. Looking back, I realize how vulnerable I was that night, how easily fear and imagination can mix with reality, and how certain places can hold onto stories, memories, and maybe something more. Whenever I think about that house now, I don't feel fear exactly. It's more like a quiet unease, a feeling that some places remember things, even when people try to forget. And every once in a while, I wonder who or what was standing in that kitchen while a scared child drank a glass of water in the dark and whispered goodnight. In Ukraine, stories about witches are everywhere. They are not treated like silly fairy tales meant only for children. They are woven into everyday life, passed down through families, whispered between neighbors, and remembered as something that could still exist even now. One of the most famous figures in these stories is the Baba Yaga. She is said to live deep in the forest, in a strange house that stands on giant chicken feet and can walk on its own. In many versions of the tale, she punishes children who behave badly by turning them into animals, sometimes goats, and cooking them into soup. Parents have told these stories for generations to scare children into behaving, but the fear around witches never fully faded, especially in rural areas. My mother grew up in one of those rural areas. Life there was simple, quiet, and deeply connected to tradition. People believed in things that could not always be explained. They trusted folk wisdom just as much as doctors, sometimes more. Superstitions were not laughed at, they were respected. When my mother tells this story, she doesn't tell it like a myth or a joke. She tells it as something she personally witnessed, something that made a deep impression on her as a child. This happened when my mother was still young. Her sister had a close friend, and that friend often spent time with another girl from the same village. One day, the two girls were walking together along a quiet road. These roads were not busy like city streets. They were narrow paths, often surrounded by fields or trees. Where it was common to pass the same people every day, everyone knew everyone else, or at least recognized them. As the girls were walking, they saw an old woman coming toward them. She was dressed plainly, like many elderly women in villages, and she was using a walking cane. There was nothing unusual about her at first glance. Old women were common sights, especially in the countryside. She stopped the girls and asked them a simple question. She asked them what time it was. One of the girls answered politely, or at least neutrally. The other girl, however, responded very rudely. She laughed and said something cruel, something along the lines of asking why an old woman even needed to know the time if she was already so old. It was the kind of comment that might come from a careless child who hadn't yet learned kindness or respect. But in that moment, it mattered. According to the story, the old woman did not just walk away. She approached the rude girl and struck her leg with her cane. It wasn't described as a violent beating, more like a sharp, deliberate hit. Then the woman continued on her way, leaving the girls behind, shocked and confused. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than an old person reacting angrily to disrespect. The girls went home and thought little of it afterward. But soon after, something strange began to happen. The girl who had been hit started limping. At first, it was slight. People thought maybe she had hurt herself while playing, or maybe the old woman's cane had caused a bruise. No one was overly worried. Children limp sometimes. Injuries happen. But the limp did not go away. Instead, it slowly got worse. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The girl's leg continued to weaken. The pain increased. Eventually, she reached a point where she could barely use the leg at all. She struggled to walk. She could not run. She could not play the way she used to. Her life changed in a way no one could explain. Her family took her to doctors. Not just one, but many. Local doctors examined her leg and found nothing physically wrong. There were no broken bones, no infections, no visible damage. They could not explain why her leg was failing her. As her condition worsened, her family took her farther away, even to doctors in other countries, hoping someone would find the cause and offer a cure. Every time, the answer was the same. There was nothing medically wrong. No diagnosis, no treatment, no solution. The girl continued to suffer. Her leg became almost useless. She lived with constant difficulty and frustration, unable to understand why this had happened to her. Over time, hope began to fade. Modern medicine had no answers. Science had no explanation. Eventually, as a last resort, she did something she never thought she would do. She went to see a white witch. In Ukrainian and broader Eastern European folklore, there is a distinction between witches who harm and witches who heal. A white witch is believed to use magic for protection, healing, and removing curses. The girl did not believe in curses or witchcraft. In fact, she reportedly dismissed such ideas for most of her life. But after years of suffering and no answers, desperation took over. She had nothing left to lose. The White Witch listened to her story. She asked questions. She examined the leg, not in a medical way, but in a spiritual one. Afterward, she told the girl something chilling. She said that the old woman who struck her with the cane was indeed a witch, and that she had placed a curse on the girl's leg in response to her disrespect. The worst part was what came next. The White Witch said that the witch who placed the curse had already died. Because of that, the curse could not be fully reversed in the usual way. According to the White Witch, curses tied directly to their caster are difficult or impossible to remove once that person is gone. However, she said that with time, care, and white magic, the effects could be weakened and eventually healed. The girl began treatments with the White Witch. These were not quick fixes. They involved rituals, prayers, herbal remedies, and repeated visits. It took time, but slowly, over a long period, the girl's leg began to improve. The limp lessened. The pain eased. Strength returned. Eventually, her leg healed completely. What makes this story especially unsettling is that my mother personally saw this girl limping before she was healed. This was not something she heard secondhand years later. She remembers the girl struggling to walk, remembers how serious the condition was, remembers how everyone talked about it in the village because no one could explain it. For my mother, this wasn't a story about superstition. It was a lived experience, something she witnessed with her own eyes. Skeptical people might say there was a psychological cause or an undiagnosed medical condition that eventually resolved. Others might argue coincidence or misinterpretation. But in the context of the time and place, those explanations did not satisfy the people who lived through it. The pattern felt too specific, the timing too precise, the connection between the insult, the strike, and the illness too clear. In villages like the one my mother grew up in, people believed that words mattered. Respect mattered. How you treated strangers, especially the elderly, mattered. There was a strong belief that some people carried power, whether they appeared ordinary or not. And there was a belief that cruelty, even casual cruelty, could come with consequences. This story stayed with my mother her entire life. It shaped how she treated people. It taught her to be careful with her words, to show respect, even when it felt unnecessary. Not out of fear alone, but out of the understanding that you never truly know who you are dealing with or what unseen forces might be at work. Whether one believes in witches or curses or not, the story carries a deeper message. It shows how deeply folklore and belief can influence real lives. It shows how unexplained illness can push people to seek answers outside of science. And it shows how fear and mystery can coexist with everyday life, especially in places where tradition runs deep. To this day, when my mother talks about witches, she doesn't laugh. She doesn't dismiss the stories as nonsense. She simply says that some things cannot be explained, and that she saw enough as a child to know that the world is stranger than we like to admit. And every time she tells this story, she always ends with the same thought. Be careful how you treat people. You never know who they really are. My great-grandmother lived a very long life. She passed away at 99 years old, about 5 years ago, And until the very end, she was sharp, clear-headed, and full of stories. She had lived through eras most people only read about, and she carried memories that stretched back into the late 1800s and early 1900s through the people who raised her. Some of the things she told me were warm and comforting. Others were strange. And one story in particular never left me, no matter how much time passed. She told me this story quietly, almost casually, like she was sharing something she had accepted long ago and no longer felt the need to dramatize. That tone made it even more unsettling. It wasn't told like a ghost story or a warning. It was told like a memory that had settled deep into her bones and stayed there for nearly a century. The story was about her uncle. Her uncle lived in the same small Missouri town the family had come from. This was a farming area, rural and isolated, where families depended on each other and most things were handled privately. This was a time before modern medicine, before reliable forensics, before strong law enforcement in the rural communities. People got sick, children died, accidents happened. And often no one questioned it too closely unless something felt very wrong. Her uncle married a woman from the same town. According to my great-grandmother, there was nothing unusual about the marriage at first. They were young, hard-working, and settled into farm life like most families did back then. They had land to work, animals to care for, and a household to run. Over time, they had 4 children. That's when things started to go wrong. The first child was born seemingly healthy. But after a few years, the child began to weaken. There was no clear illness that anyone could name. The child simply grew thinner, more tired, less able to run and play like other children. Eventually, the child died. At the time, the death was tragic, but not unheard of. Childhood mortality was common in those days. Families mourned, buried their dead, and carried on because they had no other choice. The doctors available were limited. Sometimes there were no doctors at all. People accepted loss as part of life. Then the second child began to show the same pattern. Again, the child grew weak over time. Again, there was no obvious cause. Again, the child died after a period of illness that no one could fully explain. 2 children lost from the same family was painful, but still, people tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was bad luck. Maybe it was something in the water. Maybe the children were simply frail. Then it happened again. The third child followed the same path. Weakness, illness, death. By the time the fourth child began to show the same signs, people were no longer just sad. They were uneasy. 4 children from the same household, all dying in the same slow, similar way, was not normal, even for that time. Whispers began. Neighbors talked quietly. Family members exchanged worried looks. Then the husband, my great-grandmother's uncle, became ill. He was a farmer, a strong man used to physical labor. He worked the land daily, exposed to the sun, the soil, the animals. But suddenly, he too began to weaken. He struggled to work. He complained of sickness that wouldn't go away. Over time, he deteriorated in the same way the children had. Eventually, he died. By that point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. An entire family had been wiped out one by one, all in the same household, all following a similar decline. Only one person remained alive. The wife, the mother. My great-grandmother told me that the family finally contacted whatever form of law enforcement existed at the time. This wasn't a modern police force. It was likely a sheriff or local authority with limited resources and knowledge. An investigation was opened, but it went nowhere. There were no tests that could prove poisoning, no clear evidence that could stand on its own. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. And in those days, especially in small rural communities, Women were rarely suspected of such crimes unless there was undeniable proof. Nothing happened to her. After a few years passed, the woman left town. She moved north to the closest large city. She packed up whatever she had left and disappeared from the family's daily life. According to my great-grandmother, no one ever heard from her again. No letters, no visits, no news. It was as if she had erased herself. Time moved on, as it always does. But here is the part of the story that my great-grandmother never spoke lightly about. She told me that after everything had happened, after the deaths had already occurred, she remembered visiting her uncle's house for Sunday dinner. This was before the entire pattern was fully understood, when people were still trying to believe the best. Sunday dinners were a tradition. You didn't refuse them lightly. Family obligations mattered deeply back then. She ate the food that was prepared. She sat at the table. She behaved politely, as children were expected to do. And afterward, she became sick. Not just mildly uncomfortable, but genuinely weak and ill for several days. She described the feeling as the same kind of weakness the children had shown, though hers passed instead of worsening. She recovered, but the memory stayed with her. She told me that once everything was known, once the family looked back at the sequence of events, it became very obvious to her that the deaths were not natural. She believed with certainty that the entire family had died due to foul play, and she believed she had narrowly avoided the same fate. What made this story so disturbing wasn't just the possibility of poisoning, it was the patience involved. If the woman truly was responsible, then she didn't act in a moment of rage. She didn't kill quickly. She did it slowly, carefully, over years, child by child. Then her husband, quietly, in a way that blended into the realities of life at the time. There were no screams, no public violence, no obvious crime scene. Just meals, illness, and death. My great-grandmother never claimed to know exactly how it was done. She didn't talk about specific substances or methods. She didn't speculate wildly. She simply stated what she believed and why she believed it. The pattern, the similarity, her own illness after eating there, and then the disappearance. That detail mattered to her the most. The fact that the woman left town and was never heard from again. If she had been innocent, my great-grandmother believed, she would have stayed. She would have sought family support. She would have remained connected. Instead, she vanished. I asked my great-grandmother once if she was afraid when she thought back on it. She said no. Not because it wasn't scary, but because fear had nowhere to go after that much time. She said it was simply something she understood, something she accepted, something that showed her how dangerous people can be when they hide behind normal life. She told me that what haunted her most wasn't the deaths themselves, but how ordinary everything looked from the outside. The farm, the meals, the routines. Nothing about the house would have warned you. Nothing about the woman would have screamed danger. If anything, she appeared normal, grieving, unlucky. That's what allowed it to happen. This story stayed with my great-grandmother her entire life. She didn't tell it often, but when she did, it was always the same. Calm, certain, unchanged. Time didn't blur it. Age didn't soften it. She never added dramatic details. She never exaggerated. That consistency made me believe her. When she told me she remembered becoming weak and ill after that dinner, her voice didn't shake. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was stating a fact, one that had been locked away in her memory for decades. It made me think about how many stories like this were never recorded properly. How many crimes went unnoticed because the tools to detect them didn't exist. How many families accepted tragedy because they didn't know how to question it. It also made me think about how easily someone can hide behind routine. Food is supposed to bring people together. Shared meals are symbols of trust, love, and safety. That's what makes the idea of poisoning so deeply unsettling. It turns something nurturing into something deadly. It weaponizes care. The woman in this story didn't need physical strength. She didn't need weapons. She didn't need help. If the story is true, as my great-grandmother believed, all she needed was time, access, and the benefit of the doubt. The fact that she was never held accountable makes the story even heavier. There was no justice, no answers, just suspicion and memory. And yet my great-grandmother lived a long life. She raised children. She told stories. She carried this one quietly, without bitterness, without obsession. She didn't let it consume her, but she never forgot it. I think about that sometimes, about how close she may have come to becoming another unexplained death, about how easily history could have taken a different turn, about how a single meal could have changed everything. This story isn't loud or dramatic in the way modern true crime often is. There's no chase, no courtroom drama, no resolution, just a slow, eerie realization that something was deeply wrong and that nothing could be done about it. It's frightening in a quiet way, the kind of fear that doesn't jump out at you, but settles in later when you're thinking about trust, family, and how much we assume about the people around us. My great-grandmother told me this story near the end of her life, when she had no reason to lie or embellish. She had already lived nearly a century. She had nothing to gain from making it up. She told it because it was true to her and because she believed it mattered. And now it lives with me, not as a warning exactly, but as a reminder that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a family dinner in a small Missouri town, a long time ago, where everyone eats, smiles, and goes home, unaware that something is deeply, quietly wrong. My mother lived through World War II. She was German, born into a world that would later tear itself apart in ways no one could have imagined. By the time the war reached its final, desperate stages, her family had been pushed far from anything resembling safety. They ended up behind the Russian front, in a place where rules no longer mattered, where survival depended on luck as much as it depended on silence. She was still a child when it happened. By then, everything familiar had already been stripped away. Food was scarce. Homes were damaged or abandoned. People moved when they were told to move and stayed quiet when they were told to stay quiet. Fear wasn't something that came and went. It was constant. It lived in the body, in the way people breathed, in the way they listened for footsteps outside at night. Her father, my grandfather, had been a German officer. That fact alone was a death sentence once the Russian soldiers arrived. It didn't matter what kind of man he had been. It didn't matter whether he had fought willingly or reluctantly. Uniforms erased individuality. To the advancing forces, he was the enemy, and anyone connected to him was guilty by association. When the soldiers discovered who he was, there was no discussion, no trial, no argument. The family was ordered outside. They were lined up. My mother told me later that this part of the memory never faded. The cold ground under her feet. The way her heart felt like it was beating too loudly, like it might give them away somehow. The sound of boots. The sharpness of shouted commands in a language that still felt foreign and hostile, even though she had heard it for months by then. They were going to execute them all. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. My mother stood there with the rest of her family, frozen, trying to understand what it meant to be about to die. At that age, death isn't abstract, but it also isn't fully real yet. You know it's bad. You know it's final. But part of you still waits for an adult to stop it, to say this isn't how things are supposed to go. Her grandmother stood beside her. At the very last moment, just as the soldiers were preparing to shoot, my mother turned around. She didn't do it bravely. She didn't do it with intention. She did it because she was a child who couldn't stand to look anymore. She turned, crying, overwhelmed, terrified, just as they were about to kill her grandmother. And that single, unconscious movement changed everything. The officer in charge saw her face. He froze. The shouting stopped. The tension shifted. Something broke through the machinery of war for just a second. My mother, dirty, frightened, crying, looked exactly like his daughter. A daughter he hadn't seen in years. A daughter who, in his mind, was probably still that age, still that face, even though time had surely changed her. In that moment, the war stopped being abstract for him. It wasn't Germans and Russians, officers and enemies. It was a child, his child. He halted the execution. No one moved, no one spoke. Orders that had been seconds away from becoming gunfire dissolved into silence. Against everything that should have happened, he let them live. Not only that, but after that day, he returned. Every single day. He brought my mother food from his own rations, bread, whatever he could spare. While the rest of the family slowly starved, her body began to change in the opposite direction. She gained weight. She grew stronger. She survived in a way that felt almost obscene compared to the suffering around her. My mother never forgot the guilt of that either. She was a child, but she understood enough to know that her survival came at a strange cost. Her family was still hungry, still afraid, still living under the shadow of death. And yet, she was being protected, singled out. Not because of who she was, but because of who she reminded someone else of. She told me that the soldier never spoke much. He didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize. He just handed her the food and left, day after day. A quiet, private act of humanity in the middle of something completely inhuman. If she hadn't turned around, they all would have died. That's the part that still feels impossible to accept. Not if she had fought. Not if she had screamed. Not if someone intervened. Just if she hadn't turned her head at that exact second. Her entire family's survival balanced on a movement so small it could barely be called a decision. A reflex. A child's instinct to look away from horror. When she told me this story, she didn't tell it dramatically. She didn't frame it as a miracle or a lesson. She told it quietly, like someone reciting a memory they had replayed too many times to feel emotional about anymore. But it terrified me because it stripped away any illusion that life is fair or orderly. It showed me how thin the margin really is, how survival sometimes has nothing to do with strength, intelligence, or morality. Sometimes it comes down to chance, to coincidence, to looking like someone else's daughter at the right moment in history. I think about that officer, too, about the war he had lived through, about what he must have seen, about the choices he had made before and after that moment. He wasn't a hero in any grand sense. He was part of a brutal machine. But in that one instant, something human broke through. It doesn't erase anything else he may have done. It doesn't redeem the war. It doesn't turn the story into something comforting. If anything, it makes it more disturbing, because it shows how arbitrary mercy can be, how unevenly it's distributed, how entire families can live or die based on a stranger's memory of his own child. My mother survived the war. Her family survived. But they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The knowledge that they weren't spared because they deserved to be. They were spared because of coincidence. Growing up, that story shaped how I see the world. It made me deeply uncomfortable with the idea that things happen for a reason. Because sometimes there is no reason. Sometimes there is only timing. A face, a glance, a pause before a command. That's all it takes. When people talk about history in broad strokes, about battles and borders and leaders, stories like this get lost. But this is what war really looks like at the human level. Families lined up, children crying, soldiers hesitating, lives hanging on something so small it can't be measured. To me, that's the scariest part. Not the violence, not the guns, not even the executions. It's the randomness. The idea that your entire existence can depend on a razor-thin margin you don't even know you're standing on. That one tiny movement, one unplanned second, can separate a life from a mass grave. My mother used to say that after that, she never believed in certainty again. She respected how fragile everything is, how quickly safety can vanish, how quickly it can return, just as unexpectedly. And every time I think about that moment, about her turning around while crying, I feel a chill. Because if she hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here. And neither would anyone else who came after her. All of it balanced on a single second, in a war that swallowed millions without ever noticing. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survived things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.